Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is the beautiful summer of 2018. Just got back from a fantastic seaside vacation with my family, and my wife and children had a great time, and that is the part that is most important. I am charged up and ready to chew bubblegum and kick ass, all out of bubblegum. A lot of people think that quote comes from the video game Duke Nukem. However, it actually comes from the 1988 John Carpenter film starring Rowdy Roddy Piper, known as They Live. They Live was sort of the Matrix before the Matrix, and the glasses, the sunglasses that Piper's character wears in the film were the wake-up call like the red pill is in the Matrix. Now, you're going to want to settle in here because this is going to be quite long. This is going to be commentary and a little bit of criticism of a fantastic article written by Dr. Duke Pesta from 2011. I want you to hear this and think about this in the context of my earlier video and podcast that I did on Fox Day versus the worldview of Jordan Peterson, and the one that I most recently did on the secular revolution. These are all sort of as a piece, as it were. One of the key notions that I'm trying to debunk in all of this is the idea that there's this fundamental war between religion and science. I need to expose that as a myth, because it's really just a recent historical creation. There are a lot of atheists who go around believing that this has always been the case, that this is something that goes all the way back to Plato and the Euthyphro and all of that, but it's actually a model of thinking about history that really did not come about until the end of the 1800s, and that is fully documented in the book The Secular Revolution that I recently talked about. And I've noticed a persistent problem with people who are atheists who think that when you talk about these subjects, for some reason they think that you're advocating what's known as a dominionist worldview, or that you're advocating a theocracy or something like that. Really, the only thing that I'm personally talking about is that you need to get your history right so that you understand the facts about the past, instead of this mistaken mythological worldview that so many people go around with today, thinking that they know what happened and they actually don't know what happened, because usually they only listen to the Four Horsemen or whatever of this most recent version of New Atheism, as some people like to call it. Anyway, this article that I found was at the newamerican.com. I'm not real sure what that is, but you can look it up there. The title of the article is Moral Relativism and the Crisis of Contemporary Education. I'll link all of this information below. Written by Dr. Duke Pesta in 2011. You've probably seen him or heard of him on Stefan Molyneux' show. Dr. Pesta is the director of the Freedom Project Academy, and he is a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute. And this is in some ways a culmination of almost all of the episodes that I've done before, talking about free speech, talking about the educational crisis that we face right now, talking about the problems at university, talking about the problems of student loan debts, moral relativism, and all of this. They all sort of loop in together. And as I go through this article, I will pop in and out with my own commentary and criticisms and expansions on some of the things that he talks about in here. So he begins, I entered graduate school to study English literature in the late 1980s, eventually receiving a PhD in Renaissance literature, and have been a professional academic ever since. I have reached the point in my life where I am sufficiently wizened and sufficiently jaded to be allowed the luxury of griping about how much tougher it was growing up for my generation. As a lifelong teacher, I might also be granted indulgence if I grumble about how little my college students actually know compared to what I learned. And although there is as much justice as exaggeration in these observations, the thing that never ceases to amaze me is how morally stunted and ethically underdeveloped our students are, how utterly unable to make even obvious moral distinctions, and how completely uninterested in differentiating between virtue and vice. The very concepts make them profoundly uneasy. Who says virtue is better than vice? Who am I to judge the rightness or wrongness of what someone else chooses? For these students, tolerance, that catch-all virtue into which all other virtues have been absorbed, means accepting without question all choices and modes of behavior. They are smart enough to realize that legitimizing the bad choices of others means that they are entitled to the same legitimization of their own bad choices as well, a system of mutually beneficial amorality, in which the self-interested embrace of tolerance is enough not only to absolve their own sins, but also to confer upon them a kind of active virtue that grants immunity from the moral and spiritual consequences of their choices. Both in the classroom and in campus life in general, the consequences of this counterintuitive approach to morality are disconcerting. Beyond the widespread cheating that goes on in class, not even a question of morality, just one of ingenuity and pragmatics, according to one recent survey of students' attitudes towards plagiarism and cheating. And beyond the hookup culture of easy sex and binge drinking, students no longer even recognize a moral component in the decisions they make, from the mundane to the monumental. Much of my interest in this phenomenon stems from trying to teach them the Bible, Dante, Shakespeare, Milton, Dostoevsky, and C.S. Lewis, the great theological and literary texts of our Judeo-Christian heritage. A few years back, I mentioned in class the Sermon on the Mount. The blank stares caused me to accuse them of laziness until it was revealed that not one of those 32 students had any idea what the sermon said or who delivered it. Further questioning revealed that 25 of them had been raised as Christians and 18 of them still considered themselves such. This is altogether typical of our rising generations of students, and the cultural ignorance gets worse from year to year. Like rudderless boats, these kids arrive on campus and immediately drift along with the currents of our morally relativistic university culture. And I would say here, this is why when you hear some of the atheist hysteria over how many Christians there are in the United States, it is completely misguided. It is utterly wrong-headed. It is not rooted in reality or facts at all. It's also why the situation for actual Christians is far more dire than they even realize, because they are actually facing a practical form of extinction if something doesn't change. So just think about that for a minute. You have 32 students at university, many of whom were raised in so-called Christian households and think they might know something about the Bible, but actually they don't know anything about it whatsoever. If they can't tell you who delivered the Sermon on the Mount, nor any of the contents of it, how can you effectively say those people are Christians at all? They're not. And this is a type of ignorance, of course, that can also be played upon and taken advantage of by the new atheism, because they can just say anything they want to about the Bible at all. They can quote all kinds of things out of context. And of course, these types of students are going to believe it. They're going to swallow it whole cloth because they don't know the difference. So I continue here with Dr. Pesta's article. Recently, one of my students held the position of resident assistant in his dorm, a post of responsibility that included keeping and dispensing university-provided birth control to students under his supervision, including a year's worth of the morning after abortion pill, which he had been given at the start of fall term. He related to the class how his entire supply of these emergency pills had been distributed to students in his dorm the very first weekend of classes in September. Concerned about the instances of moral sclerosis so evident in my own students, I volunteered to teach a few classes at a local Catholic school near the town where I live. Figuring it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness, I offered courses on theology, a class on the Bible, and another on Christian writers, hoping to expose them to traditional moral reasoning before they reached the universities. It had been 25 years since I had set foot in a Catholic high school, and in many ways the place was unrecognizable. The amount of effort that went into shielding kids from a too insistently Catholic message was eye-opening, and my discussions with classrooms full of juniors and seniors, many of whom had been in Catholic schools since kindergarten, revealed an almost complete ignorance of Scripture, a staggering inability to articulate any moral position at all, and remarkably vocal disdain for the moral authority of their church. And I move on to his first section title, which is The Origins and Purpose of Humanistic Education. I chose a career in the humanities in part because the study of literature has always, up until very recent times, been associated with making people better, more conscientious moral agents. The Greeks and Romans respectively used the words creator and prophet to describe their poets, and literature was viewed alongside philosophy as a schoolhouse of moral virtue and instruction. The Roman poet Horace described the poet-philosopher as one who teaches while delighting and coding the serious moral message of literature with the pleasing veneer of art and story. Readers who delighted in the tales of heroes and quests also encountered, while reading them, high moral examples of courage, determination, and sacrifice, alongside monitory injunctions against cowardice, sloth, and greed. And I point out here, too, for a time, comic books in our own age served this role. From the 1940s until the early 1990s, then comic books suddenly switched to promoting the bad guys, the villains, the anti-heroes, which is fine in terms of storytelling, but the last decade has witnessed the complete SJW infiltration and takeover of the comic books industry, so that they now ram the social justice obsessions that they personally hold down the throats of their readers, and it's really killing the comic book industry. And there's several people out there on YouTube who cover this basically on a daily basis. Back to the article. That greatest and most influential collection of moral exempla, the Holy Bible, for all its manifest philosophy, delivers that philosophy more often than not in the form of story, song, adage, or proverb, employing the techniques of drama, irony, foreshadowing, epic, and even tragedy. And I would point out here, too, that as Bishop Barron has said before, when people ask him as a Catholic, is the Bible true? And he says, well, that's a little bit like walking into a library and saying, are these books true? And he says, well, it depends. Depends on which section of books you're referring to. We have to go around and investigate those to find out which is which and how they're supposed to be viewed and how they are to be interpreted. Back to the article. Christ himself quite often preferred to deliver his moral teachings in the form of many stories called parables, simple and pleasing tales that contain profound philosophy for those who had ears to hear the deeper moral message. Indeed, for every tablet of commandments handed down in the Bible or list of formulaic pronouncements, there are dozens of folk stories, dramas, novellas, lyrics, and moral truths rendered artistically and poetically so as to make them pleasing and comprehensible to persons of all educational backgrounds. Rather than traduce the great insights of Scripture, the recognition that God frequently chose art and story as the means to reveal his truth to men demonstrates that God himself is the world's first and greatest artist. And as the ancients knew all too well, those who sought to recreate and distill the great moral truths of God through art also participated in a sublime act of creation, one that put them as close to divine truth as any calling on earth. It was under these attitudes and assumptions that the Western world developed the humanities to serve as handmaidens to the great truths of heavenly theology, a discipline that studied truth as revealed by God through Scripture. In the wake of theology, each discrete humanistic discipline codified its contribution to moral truth by virtue of a different human faculty. Thus, through philosophy, people employed the faculty of reason in pursuit of truth, while history sought truth through the power of memory, and literature and the arts pursued truth through imagination. True, each might borrow from the other. The philosopher Plato famously chronicled his wisdom in the form of dialogues, an artistic device where two characters reveal philosophical import through the artifice of imagined conversation. The poet-dramatist Shakespeare often framed his dramatic message within a well-documented historical event, like the assassination of Julius Caesar. And as we have seen, great sages, saints, and holy men, in imitation of God, have used imaginative storytelling as a way to impart deep moral and philosophical truths. For thousands of years in the West, it was the humanities, as nursed and taught in the schools, which reinforced theology, helping inculcate moral values and instill a love of moral virtue across cultures and in the hearts of individuals. Next section title, How Humanistic Education Went Astray. Over the last 3 centuries, however, a span of time that witnessed the rise of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, the dawn of naturalism and modernism, and the dominance in our time of post-modernism, the Judeo-Christian underpinnings of Western culture have been shaken, eroded, and ultimately rejected altogether by new, man-centered ways of viewing reality. And I'll point out here that you have to remember, this is not at all on accident. It was never born out of a cool, calm, collected observation of the facts of the world. In fact, the facts of the world in no way whatsoever tell you any such thing. Rather, as pointed out in the book The Secular Revolution, it was the concerted efforts of hundreds and thousands of activist secularizers who oftentimes very specifically hated Christianity. And this also helps to explain why we have modern or contemporary leftists who are very simpatico in their relationship towards Islam. It's an atheist, deist, freethinker alliance, which dates back at least to the 16th century. Some have even said it dates back to the 13th century. And it isn't the enemies who are at the gates that you have to worry about. It's those who are inside who open the gates for the enemies to come in. So as we proceed here, the rise of science and the unrivaled hegemony of the scientific method Advancements that undeniably increased technological and material comforts for countless billions of human beings also destroyed the very premises on which moral truth and consensus had been constructed. Faith no longer carried any weight in a world that sought truth only in data that could be verified empirically. Scripture became reduced to mere mythology in the face of our implacable march toward the conquest of nature, the only realm available to the study of physics and biology, based as they are on sensory observation and perception. And as theology became synonymous with superstition and faith in God, the intellectual parallel believing in unicorns and leprechauns, the transcendent foundation of Western morality, which kept it all together, anchored in a better world than this and supported by a mind much greater than ours, vanished into thin air. The inevitable rise of moral relativism was a consequence of this metaphysical vacuum. As the big T truths of the past, the moral absolutes upon which any coherent and enduring system of morality depend, were replaced with the utterly subjective little t truths of a worldview imprisoned exclusively in nature, an outlook relentlessly hostile to the idea of a transcendent God who created nature and who exists beyond it as the first and greatest of the enduring truths. Moral relativism, then, is the idea that all non-scientific truths, and especially moral truths, are arbitrary, subjective, and constructed entirely by the mind of man, incorporating all of the prejudices, irrationalities, and limitations of the incomplete perspectives and exclusionary approaches of the cultures that impose these values in the first place. Hence, freed from the shackles of objectivity and utterly divorced from theological certainty, the study of the humanities shifted dramatically. Rather than reinforce ultimate capital T truth and serve as her compass and schoolhouse, contemporary humanities evolved into a cannibalistic tool of the new scientific method, deconstructing the very notion of objective moral truth and serving only to critique and ultimately condemn as arbitrary the wisdom and moral foundations of the past. In categorically rejecting objective notions of truth and decrying traditional value systems, the humanities, as taught almost without question in schools and universities today, exist to destroy the very principles upon which humanistic learning evolved and nourished civilization, liberating culture from the harmful prejudices and hegemonies of traditional religion and morality. And you have to remember, too, that's one of the key roots of how the term liberty was used in the past. It didn't just mean the liberty to do things. It meant the liberty from specifically religious indoctrination and whatnot. While the shockwaves of these philosophical shifts can be witnessed across all fields of human endeavor, it is in education where the consequences of moral relativism are most devastating. For thousands of years, the chief aim and civilizing purpose of education had been moral development, an incessant recognition of the limits of human wisdom in the face of the divine, and an insistent reminder of the greater, unseen moral order that underpins the naturalistic world of the jungle, a world where power alone dictates right, and mere survival at any cost equals truth in the rawest, most naked sense of the word. Yet the educational paradigms of today, manifested most acutely in the morally relativistic approaches of the humanities, actually reinforce this Darwinian primacy of nature and work against civilization. And a note here, too, that you have to recall this is precisely the way that Dr. Jordan Peterson defines truth. He uses it in a very practical and pragmatic Darwinian sense of the term, and not at all in the way that, for example, his disputes with Sam Harris have been over this. Sam Harris uses the more naturalistic, materialistic concept of scientific objectivity. But of course, that is rooted in empiricism, as we've pointed out before. And empiricism, of course, lends itself to subjectivity, relativism, and philosophical skepticism in some senses. And remember, as I continually point out, and as I point out in the book that I'm working on now, when you move through metaphysics down to epistemology and then from epistemology to ethics, what that turns into in ethics, if it isn't a form of pure relativism, it usually is consequentialism or utilitarianism. Moving down to the next section here in his article, it starts at the top. In the journal articles and published books that secure tenure and impose the ideological dictates determining the construction of curricula, the pedagogy taught in graduate programs, and the way we train teachers from kindergarten through high school and beyond. At the highest levels of academia, the tenured professoriate and the professors, deans, provosts, chancellors, and university presidents who almost always arise from the privileged ranks of this tenured class, There exists a dangerously monolithic echo chamber where relativistic, postmodern ideas about the world, culture, and truth have become calcified. The consequences to education of this ideological conformity can be witnessed at every level of public and in many cases private instruction. For many private schools only hire teachers trained and certified by state-run education programs. The dominance of moral relativism in our humanities curricula from kindergarten through graduate school guarantees that the study of philosophy, history, art, and literature amounts to little more than an amoral, unreflexive acknowledgement of the random, chaotic, arbitrary, and ultimately meaningless nature of reality. In this system, the traditional liberal arts approach to learning has been transformed into an educational paradigm in which the humanities appropriate the methodology of the sciences in order to strip humanistic learning of any ultimate value or objective whatsoever. But even more insidiously, the principle of moral relativity has been co-opted by academics not only to displace traditional liberal arts education, but also to systematically replace it with the politically tendentious objectives of modern humanities programs. This is the great and glaring contradiction of contemporary postmodern approaches to education, which all claim to view learning through the lens of moral relativism. Beginning from the premise that all moral systems are mere social constructs without any transcendent claims to truth, the modern academic feels justified in exposing the truth claims of previous or competing cultures as bogus, rendering serious consideration of them moot from a moral perspective. Thus, there can never exist the possibility that a professor or student might take seriously the faith claims and moral injunctions of Judeo-Christianity. And again here, I have to point out to you that Jordan Peterson does not take Christianity as objective truth claims. He sees it as an evolutionary psychological phenomenon. He sees it as a sort of mythopoetic type of thing that needs to be interpreted, but he does not see it as a true revealed religion, which is the way that, say, a Christian such as Fox Day sees Christianity. Back to the article. To do so would immediately expose the believer as illogical and absurd. For the professor who took seriously these faith claims, the consequences could include professional isolation and even the denial of tenure, while students who persist in believing in the face of moral relativism very often face ridicule, intellectual alienation, and a reduced grade for the course. This worldview, correctly understood, is very much like a sword without a handle. As soon as you seize it, to cut down your opponent's position, you cut off your own fingers. For if moral relativism makes it impossible to take seriously any claim to truth that originates outside a laboratory, then surely that must include the faith claims of contemporary liberalism. But anyone who has spent meaningful time in our institutions of learning knows just how seriously teachers and academics take their liberal worldviews. If the goal is merely to divorce all meaning and belief from the humanities, then doing so across the board would produce a kind of level playing field, however degraded the resulting view of mankind. And I also note here that Stephen Hicks, the objectivist philosopher, points this out in his fantastic book called Explaining Postmodernism, which I'll link below. Everybody needs to get that and read that. Back to the article. But the liberal postmodernism and moral relativity that dominate our schools seek to root out traditional values and meanings in order to supplant them with the liberal materialist creeds of academics, belief systems every bit as faith-based as those they seek to remove. Despite the obvious contradiction and hypocrisy, liberal academics proceed blithely down this intellectually tortured path by elevating politics to the exalted place in culture formerly occupied by morality. And here I'd like to point out two different things. I think the way that he's using the term liberal here, he is meaning leftist. He's not meaning liberal in the sense of the way that a libertarian would use it, the way that, for example, Stephen Hicks uses it as an objectivist. He's talking about the leftism that has gone so far beyond liberal that it's actually illiberal. And the other thing I would point out here is a lot of these problems that he's pointing to happen because atheists, instead of worshiping nothing whatsoever, they remove God, but then they end up putting the state into the center of their worldview. They end up basically worshiping the state or the leaders of the state, especially when they are leftists who they approve of. Back to the article. The maxim, everything is political, forms a primary commandment in the Church of Academia, a bit of dogma so unchallenged in academic circles that it might have sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus himself, had not the whole concept of deity been rendered superfluous by postmodern dialectics. Although everything cultural might indeed have a political dynamic, to use contemporary parlance, that certainly does not prove that all things cultural are merely political, or that they can have no moral or transcendent meaning beyond politics. Nevertheless, academics today proceed religiously down this path with all the conviction of Saul before he hit the road to Damascus. As G.K. Chesterton observed trenchantly, and I would encourage everybody to buy Chesterton's books and check out what he had to say. He said, quote, "When people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything." As we have seen, the tearing down and eventual dismissal of traditional morality underpinned by a transcendent God left a vacuum at the very core of civilization and culture. And I pointed this out before in my presentation on Nietzsche, which I'll also link below. These discredited ideas had given shape and form to the vibrant cultures that grew up in their wake over thousands of years. In their absence, and because they could no longer see Moses on top of the mountain, postmodern academics could not live with the void, and so transformed their politics, into a golden calf before which they continue to do obeisance. Thus, the unquestioningly accepted maxim that everything is political justifies and privileges, at the expense and derogation of all competing ideas, the myriad leftist ideological approaches to culture that have choked contemporary education in the humanities. Among the most pervasive of these leftist discourses are Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial studies. And I would point out here that when he says feminist, he should probably clarify that he's talking about like third wave and fourth wave feminism, probably not so much first wave and second wave feminism. In today's universities, it is almost impossible to encounter philosophy, history, literature, art, or even theology without studying them exclusively through the lens of one or all of these tendentious political perspectives, because liberal politics alone provides a neutral platform from which to discuss culture. Every painting, novel, historical movement, or economic system has meaning only insofar as it sheds light on the racism, sexism, imperialism, bigotry, or homophobia of Western culture. Thus, almost every single course in the humanities overtly or implicitly reduces humanistic study to a mindless and endlessly repetitive exercise in race, class, and gender, the holy trinity of contemporary academic discourse. And this is what, of course, ties over into the oppression Olympics, the victim culture. And really, people just need to stop thinking of themselves as victims. You're never going to be able to take charge of your life. You're never going to be able to change anything unless you stop seeing yourself as a perpetual victim. That is a loser mentality to have, and losers with that loser mentality are going to get bowled over by the world. And they're going to run around perpetually angry because of it. I continue here. We have reached the point in Western education where politically leftist approaches to culture have become institutionally sanctioned, unquestioningly normative, and zealously guarded. They alone offer students a legitimate position from which to analyze and critique culture. The dominance of such worldviews to the detriment of free inquiry and the perversion of the educational mission accounts for the overwhelming liberal bias in American education, the uniformly leftist sentiments of faculties and administrators, and the impressive success of schools in churning out factually illiterate, technically incompetent, but politically liberal and increasingly activist graduates. As Abraham Lincoln observed with alarming prescience, quote, "The philosophy of the classroom in one generation is the philosophy of the government in the next." And I would also like to point out here that this sort of cultural milieu, this sort of complex set of idea traits also helps explain the muddle-minded thinking of what are known as left libertarians or bleeding heart libertarians. And that, mind you, does not mean that I am a right libertarian. I just view it strictly from the NAP, the way that Walter Block talks about that libertarianism is not left or right. But when you inject it with all of this assumed leftism, this idea that libertarians have to be committed to all kinds of other social justice notions, I think that is monstrously mistaken. And in the concluding section here, Dr. Pesta offers some possible solutions. Despite the current plight of American education, there are some encouraging signs on the horizon. The number of voices who recognize and speak out about the problem is larger than ever before. Access to new media helps disseminate the message and keep it part of the 24-hour news cycle. Recently, serious, nonpartisan analysis has begun to emerge that questions the need for a college education at all, as costs skyrocket and returns on investment diminish exponentially. It is commonplace to point out that the cost of no commodity in American life has risen as precipitously as college tuition, and every metric indicates that a college degree is no guarantee of employment, or even that students have mastered the basic skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic that were taken for granted in high school graduates just 40 years ago. And I've done several presentations on this also. I will link those below as well. For the first time in American history, collective student loan debt has surpassed the credit card debt of the entire nation. Even as President Obama, this dates it, 2011, federalizes the student loan industry to grant easier access to the crushing student loan debt that threatens to impoverish an entire generation of creative writing and women's studies majors. Broke though they may be and facing the prospect of lifelong debt, but the president is nonetheless wise to bet that these academically mistrained, chronically disaffected, and underemployed young leftists will continue to vote reliably Democrat for many years to come. And of course, that is the thing that is most important to the left. They don't care about what happens to people. Further, almost all of the Republican or Libertarian challengers vying to run against an Obama second term have pledged to eliminate or express willingness to consider eliminating the ideologically extreme, shamelessly expensive, and wearingly Byzantine Department of Education. Good riddance. I wish someone could ever do that. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. Another encouraging development is the burgeoning homeschool movement, and I've been working on a presentation for that. I just need to get it out quickly, which provides a real threat to the business-as-usual mentality of public schools, allowing parents to supervise their children's educations and supplement their academic studies with traditional exercises and moral education. Various online programs have emerged to assist homeschool families in their quest to restore traditional education, most notably Freedom Project Education, which offers online a complete classical education in the tradition of the Founding Fathers from kindergarten through high school. But regardless of these developments, things will remain dire unless parents who still control the purse strings demand meaningful reform and vote with their feet until their voices are heard. This may mean settling on lesser-name universities, branch campuses, or vocational schools for their children, or encouraging kids to consider eschewing higher education altogether in favor of other options. And I would point out here he should probably follow Tom Wood's advice on writing. Eschew the use of the word eschew anytime you're writing. Anyway, back to the article. Including military service or trade apprenticeships. One thing is certain, despite the Marxist and anti-capitalist rhetoric emanating from classrooms and faculty lounges all across the country, universities are as much driven by money as the most reviled corporations. Indeed, if you had not just read this essay, it would be tempting to speculate, given the way the universities treat their, quote, customers, charging hugely inflated costs and providing so little of tangible value in return, why there is no Occupy the Quad movement to rival the Occupy Wall Street crowd. The answer is painfully obvious. And that'll be all for today. Please check out the source of this at thenewamerican.com. Check out Dr. Duke Pesta's other fantastic work and his numerous appearances on Stefan Molyneux Show, Freedomain Radio. And please thumbs up, like, subscribe, share it around on other social media, all that sort of stuff. I need all of the help that I can get. Thanks.